Hi, folks. Thank you for joining us for the history of the Carrig-Rohane Frame Shop with William Adair and Richard Whitney. Here to introduce the program is the Director of Mill Events and Activities, Ed Gordon.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Old Schwam Mills February talk. Please save your questions until the speakers finish up talking, and you could send your questions via the chat room at the bottom center of your screens. Tonight, we're going to be hearing about the history of the Carrig-Rohane Frame Shop that was located in Boston's Back Bay. This company were customers of the Schwam's picture frame manufactory in the early 20th century. And so first, we're going to hear from the mill's president, Dermot Whitaker, who will give us an overview of the mill's history, both as a manufactory and museum. Dermot.
And thanks, Ed. We're very glad to have Bill and Richard with us tonight, taking the time to discuss this exciting and very interesting history of frame making in Boston. The Old Schwam Mill is a 19th century picture frame factory that continued into the 20th. They specialized in oval frames, but they also made the moldings as special order for all kinds of frame shops in Boston, the straight molding that becomes part of a frame built by a frame shop. The place was in business from 1864 to 1969, and briefly you see the owners here, Charles, who was an immigrant from Germany, and his son, Carl William. And then Carl William's son, Clinton Schwam, and his brother Louis ran the place through most of the 20th century and the time that we'll be talking about tonight. And Clinton's son, Elmer, was the last owner. And when he retired in 1969, the mill was saved by a woman named Patricia Fitzmaurice, who organized a trust to run it both as a living history museum, still making frames, and as a kind of community art center. Here's the place in 1864. And then later on in the 1880s, the Schwams expanded it and had that remnant pond for water power. They also used steam to run their mill through most of its history. And finally, electric motors. There it is in 28, really the center of the period we'll be talking about tonight. And there's Patricia Fitzmaurice, the woman who in 1969 had the vision to save a small family-run New England factory with all its equipment and all its frame-making procedures and traditions and business records, not to mention the original building and adjacent buildings. There she is working with two of the older workers from the mill on a frame. And we continue to make these kind of oval frames today. Unfortunately, the machine that made the straight molding, which is what most concerns our talk tonight, that machine was sold when the business was sold in '69. However, we still have the faceplate elliptical lathes that enable us to make these oval frames. And our turner on staff, David Graff, who first selects a template or makes one using that ellipsograph to make the four quadrants of his frame. He cuts those out on a bandsaw. And here he is kind of evening out the two sides of the piece and then squaring off the ends so that they're perpendicular to each other. And then the four pieces of the frame going together will make an oval. Here he is adding the finger joints that allow the frame to be securely glued together. And here he is gluing the frame up in the glue room, strapping it in tightly with a strap clamp. Now he's secured the frame to the elliptical faceplate lathe with screws from behind. And he begins using the elliptical faceplate lathes, turning the frame and with his chisels imparting a profile to it. And then here he is lastly sort of sanding the rough spots and finishing the frame. And so the Schramm continues to make these for frame shops, for individuals, for museums who need replicas, and historical houses that also need replicas. Frequently, people use mirrors with them now. But this is the work of the mill. But in addition, we have areas for exhibitions, both on history and art upstairs. And we're open Tuesdays and Saturdays from 10 o'clock till 4 o'clock. And people can come to the mill and see the place in action, have a tour of the entire place, and get to know the mill better if they want. This area here is where the molding machine used to be. And although the machine's gone, in the pockets that you see above there are profiles that represent the work of past jobs for customers. And so there are many of the pockets that contain hundreds of jobs that were done for frame shops in Boston, along with the metal knives that used to be attached to the molding machine. And here's just one pocket with profiles for Walfrid Tulin, one of the people we'll be talking about tonight. The molder would keep these usually with the knives as a way of going back and repeating orders if the customer wanted additional molding. And most times the orders for molding were hundreds of feet at a time, usually oak or birch, but occasionally other woods. Here's a ledger with Walfrid Tulin's account for the mill going back to 1928. Basically, when he would order things, they had an order number and then the wholesale price of what he ordered over there on the right. Here's one particular order for Walfrid Tulin. This one was from 1940. And then we also have what was left of the job, a piece that the molder would cut off and annotate on the back with the date and name of the customer. And then those would go up into those cubbies we saw earlier. So there's a few others that you can see here. And these all still exist in their cubbies. And they'd be annotated on the back like this, saying when the job was done for the customer. And here's one that clearly got ordered and reordered between 1938 and 1947. And so from here, I'm going to ask Ed if he will tell us a little bit about frame making in Boston.
Okay. You know, what accounts for the rise in demand for quality picture frames in the Boston area around the turn of the 20th century? Prior to the unframed canvases of the mid-20th century abstract expressionists, painters set off their works with wooden frames. Framed artwork could be seen by the public in Boston at the Museum of Fine Arts beginning in 1876, when it opened its doors in Copley Square, and in a more limited elitist way at the Boston Athenaeum, Boston Art Club, and the St. Botolph Club. During the decades preceding the Civil War, well-to-do Bostonians were traveling to the museums of Paris and Italy to view framed fine art. The second half of the 19th century witnessed a growing number of well-to-do Boston collectors who were mostly based in the developing Back Bay neighborhood. These Gilded Age families bought European paintings, especially works from the Barbizon and Impressionist painters in France, often purchasing artwork on the advice of influencers such as painter William Morris Hunt, who became a full-time Back Bay resident in 1862 after years of living in France. In addition, as noted by Bainbridge Bunting in Houses of the Back Bay, French and Flemish art dealers began to see Boston as a fertile field for selling continental artwork This was as early as the 1850s. Boston Brahmin families like the Appletons, Wigglesworth, Rosses, and especially Isabella Stewart Gardner began to assemble important collections within their Back Bay townhouses. By the early 1900s, local artists, some of whom were graduates of the school at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, were setting up studios on the flat of Beacon Hill and St. Botolph neighborhoods. The founding of the Copley Society in 1879, the oldest nonprofit art association in the US, is also indicative of Boston's late 19th century rise as an American city where picture framers found plenty of demand for their product among collectors and institutions, as well as the artists themselves. By the 1920s, the Back Bays, Boylston, and Newbury streets were transitioning from residential to a kind of a residential commercial hybrid with galleries and frame shops, popping up along these thoroughfares. And this was thanks in part to the rise of a new source of commerce, the automobile trade. And Carrig-Rohane, that shop is variously listed at Clarendon Street and Boylston Street. So let's get to introducing our speakers. And this evening, we're going to be hearing from William Adair and Richard Whitney. Bill Adair is the founder of Gold Leaf Studios based in Washington, D.C. He is a frame conservator, frame historian, and master gilder. He began his career in frame conservation at the Smithsonian Institution's National Portrait Gallery, where he became fascinated with gilding and the history of frames. Mr. Adair writes and lectures on frame history and conservation. He is the founding director for the International Institute for Frame Study, a nonprofit archive, and he's a founding member of the Society of Gilders. He received the 1992 Rome Prize awarded by the American Academy in Rome. And then turning to Richard Whitney, he is, Fine Art Connoisseur, that publication has called him one of the giants of the field of figurative painting. Mr. Whitney's portraits and landscapes hang in more than 800 public and private fine art collections worldwide. He has won over 40 regional and national awards, as well as 3 grants from the Elizabeth Greenshields Foundation of Montreal, Canada. Whitney was awarded an honorary Doctor of Fine Arts from the University of New Hampshire in 2015. He is the author of the book, Painting the Visual Impression, which summarizes the basic principles of representative painting. This was first published in 1972. And I should add that Bill Adair has really a groundbreaking publication on the history of American frames that I believe dates to 1982. So without further ado, I give you Bill and Richard.
Hello.
Oh,
Richard. It's really wonderful to be here. The subject of the Carrig-Rohane shop has been on my mind quite a few years, ever since I took a workshop at the old Schwam Mill in 1973. I heard about you then as a painter, and I heard about Jack Eckberg, and I heard about the Carrig-Rohane business. And really, it was the start there at the mill that got my interest in frame history. So to tell everybody just a brief background on the development of the Carrig-Rohane shop, it started with a man by the name of Hermann Dudley Murphy, who was a painter And he needed to have great frames for his work, much like you do, Richard. You need to have a great frame, like the one hanging right behind you.
Thank you.
And so he banded with Walfrid Tulin, who was a Swedish woodcarver, and also Charles Prendergast, who was the brother of the painter Maurice Prendergast. And they had worked at a shop called Dahl and Richards in the turn of the century. And Murphy and Tulin and Prendergast got together and formed this enigmatic shop. And the name stems from a Welsh Gaelic name that Murphy had in his ancestry, and it means red rock, Carrig-Rohane.
Mhm.
And it started in Winchester, in Murphy's basement of his house, and then it moved down into Boston. And up until about 1911, they operated it, and it was taken over by the Vos brothers, Vos Galleries, and operated up till the end of the war, where Jack Ekberg had worked. And Jack was instrumental in carrying on the traditions, and also Walfrid Tulin. I first met Jack Ekberg through a man named Bill Coles, who was a Murphy scholar, a art historian there in Boston. He took me up to meet Jack in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, to his shack there in the woods. And we had the most delightful conversations and correspondences over the years regarding his ideas on frame design and his ability to interpret what Murphy wanted lots of times. He had all these eccentric stories from World War I when he was a kid, and his father was the foreman of the shop. So he absorbed all of that great business, and there he was sitting in the woods in New Hampshire with all of the tools and drawings and all that knowledge, and you were able to find him. Could you talk a little bit about how you ran into him as well?
Yes, for I had always dreamed of having a frame maker carve frames specific designs for my paintings, unique designs for one of a kind. And I heard from a frame shop that there was an old man living in the shack in Fitzwilliam who, and I went to see him. And Jack showed me these very small frames that he had made for his neighbors. It was nothing impressive at all. So I was on my way out the door, and he said, "Gee, Richard, I'm sorry, I don't have anything to show you. But I used to do my frames used to hang in the Smithsonian Museum. And I did framing for Vos galleries. I framed for Tarbell and Benson and DeCamp, Prendergast. And I was the chief frame maker of the Carrig-Rohane Frame Shop in Boston, and I taught Guido how to frame. So obviously I stopped in my tracks, and I said, I have brought with me a painting I did of my youngest daughter, my oldest daughter at the time, I'm sorry, Deborah, and pretend that this painting is going to hang up at the Smithsonian Museum. Show me what you can do. I don't care how much it costs. I will, whatever. I want to see what you can do. And do we want to show that now? We can talk about that a few minutes later. If you want to show you the rest of the frames that you have. Bill, if you'd like to talk about the rest of the history of the frame shop.
I was thinking that Jack was a repository of designs, but also Clarence Tulin, who was Walfrid Tulin's son, had contacted me as well. I wanted to just mention that because he was an integral part of the Carrig-Rohane shop. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to connect with him, but he told me he had a trunk full of artifacts from the early days of the shop. And so I delayed, and he had moved, and he had actually died. He said it was in an attic in a house in Maine. So these things are out there. and people need to perhaps value them in a way that I'm doing a little research on the frame makers of Boston, and it's John Doggett who really was the precursor to the Carrig-Rohane shop. He was an amazing frame maker. He made many of the frames for famous painters, Henry Sargent, Thomas Sully, and he was in Roxbury there. So I can imagine this group of immigrants, English, Doggett, and then German immigrants coming in like the Schwams and producing not only frames, but furniture and furnishings. They were big art dealers as well. So it was a combination of frame making.
Mhm.
And that was a fertile ground, as Dermot was talking about. The middle class had developed a taste for frames, and it was there in Boston that started the Arts and Crafts Society, really, and the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, and the Massachusetts Colonial societies there have these archives filled with amazing information. And Richard Nylander is a scholar on furniture of this period. And if you go on the internet, you can find many references to this great tradition of frame making in Boston. So one of the texts of the time referred to how typical of Bostonians to want to reform things, starting with the Tea Party and now with frames. So it was kind of a joke that they were reforming frames, but they really named the frame after Hermann Dudley Murphy. We framers call it the Murphy frame, and it's this profile right here. It's a simple cassetta that this is one that Jack Ekberg made for me, and you can see the profile is really quite simple, and on the back we just write all the information of how to do it. And so it's the Murphy style frame was really an Eastlake idea, or the reduction of ornamentation, the simplification of things, because they thought that all that Victorian stuff was very meretricious and excessive. So this American trait of the simplification has been a theme running throughout our decorative arts. And although it was the major influential book of the period was Charles Locke Eastlake's Hints of Household Taste, which was published in 1872, and it was the most popular book in America for ladies finishing schools and what have you. And they really promoted this. So Murphy was a prolific painter, and he needed to have these great frames for his work. So that is the origins of what we know so far about these designs. I would also like to mention that the archives of American art have a complete collection of the frame designs of Hermann Dudley Murphy, easy to access online. It's absolutely incredible, and you'll be able to cruise through 100 or so of those photographs of their frames. And I asked Jack Ekberg about these photographs, and he told me they scrubbed all the glass negatives off during the war, World War I. They needed to frame diplomas. So that's what happened to the original negatives.
Yeah.
But here I see we pulled up our screen here. Thank you. This is a frame that was given to me by Jack Ekberg.
All right.
He wanted me to have this as a gift of friendship. And that's on a poster that we made. Richard, do you can we see some more of those slides that are there?
Yeah, read. Yeah. Yeah, there are more slides of the Murphy frames. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, and show Richard's pairings too would be good. There we go. That's the insignia on the back. They carved their name on the back, and every Carrig-Rohane shop frame is painted red. That is the hallmark of it. And they have the moniker, or the M in the center is Murphy 1911, and then it was the Thulin Murphy Company. So it goes through a couple of iterations, all hand carved. And that's one from my collection.
Beautiful,
Next.
beautiful.
Yeah, that's the typical Murphy frame, the box frame with the incising, the Eastlake business, and there's hammer carving on the panel to reflect light as your eye moves around it, like the brushwork in a canvas. And so this kind of frame would be beautiful for a still life with heavy impasto paint or a landscape. And this is the one that we talked about before that's on the poster. It is a theatrical frame. It would have been for a portrait, maybe a photograph of somebody, but the drapery like that and the sgraffito, Jack told me when he did sgraffito or scratching through the tempera paint to expose the gold with a wooden stylus, he said that somewhere he always put his initials and he snuck it in on the face because he said artisans don't always get their fair due. And I thought I was going to look for it. I've never found the JE initials on it, but I'm still looking. Next.
Yeah, beautiful. There you go. Look at that.
Yeah. So the surface is gilded first, and then the black tempera paint, egg tempera, is put over it, and then a wooden stylus is scratched through. But this is from the 1920s. You can see it's been handled quite a bit. But the delicate calligraphy and steady hand is very important to effect this work successfully. Yeah, it's nice. There are little hearts in there and little birds. He tried to tell me he did zoomorphic images sometimes.
Beautiful,
Wow, look
beautiful.
at that.
It's got quite a patina on it. The red that you see is the gilder's clay that's underneath the gold, that's rubbed through handling and age. Considered a hallmark of beauty. Tell us about this one, Richard.
Yeah, Jack made a booklet of drawings of Murphy frames for me, and this was the cover of the booklet, and describing a typical Murphy frame with the silver leaf and gold leaf, apparently on the around the carvings, and then he goes into the size and so forth and signs it down at the bottom. And there's several more drawings I think I gave you.
Yeah, this is actually a Venetian design.
Okay, all right.
Murphy went to Venice and brought back with him. It's a Canaletto design. This profile and the carving of the leaf and the flower, and it's one that repeats itself through many of Murphy's patterns. So.
Okay.
Did you do that one too?
Yeah, this is part of this. This is in this booklet. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the next one. Yeah.
Richard, excuse me, it says Marler, M-A-R-L-O-R. Is that the name of the client?
I have no idea.
Because there was a guy named Clark Marler who gave me a book on gilding once. I wonder if that was him.
It looks like Darlor, D-A-R-L-O-R. Oh, I see yeah, I see. Yeah, Marler. All right. Yes.
Clark Marler, Piazzi,
Marler. Yeah.
Pizzati. Maybe they are the names. And so Jack worked for a lot of different people. That's really great.
Yes.
And that frame appears to be made of a couple different pieces that were joined somehow. Is that possible?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Two-member frame, inner and
Yeah.
outer, and they do that so it doesn't warp. You got two different pieces going on and keeps it stable.
Yeah, we have a number of pieces in the Schwam's cubbies that are meant to be joined together, sometimes with an actual tongue and groove or something, and
That's
they would
fine.
be
Yeah, we'll go in
glued.
there.
Okay. And next, yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, another Murphy corner, typical frame.
Yeah.
And next. Yeah. Yeah, this would be the way the typical Carrig-Rohane frames, what they would sign on the back. This is on the painting at the frame that you're going to show in a minute. And next and this is be Jack Egberg's signature. Any frame that he did for me, I had him sign and date on the back of his frames. Yep. And next. Okay, this is a frame that I bought from Jack. It's actually 33.3 karat gold leaf, which was discontinued, in the 20s, I believe, maybe earlier than that. This is dated 1913. It's a Carrig-Rohane frame. And I wanted to keep it, obviously. And so I painted my wife's portrait. And I designed her portrait specifically for the frame. It's a 12 by 9-inch portrait. And the frame is so wide, I decided to pose her in a very, very strong black and red outfit so that the image of herself is very strong and counterbalances the width of the frame. So the frame doesn't overwhelm the portrait. So I think it marriages the frame and the portrait marriage very well. And if we read, if the next slide, you see a close-up of the corner. Yeah. And Bill mentioned that the Carrig-Rohane frames have the red toning, and you can see the red inside the corner of the carving.
Yeah, there really is some great quality to this frame, Richard. And one thing I'd like to point out is that there's no miter joint that's coming through the gesso.
Right.
And there are a number of ways to prevent that from happening. And clearly they knew what they were doing. The first way is when you cut your miter joint, you leave a little space in the back of the back end of the frame open. So when the wood expands and contracts, it moves there and doesn't cause a joint to split. The other technique is to carve a V into the back of the molding, a relief joint right along perpendicular to the miter joint with a V chisel. And this prevents it from opening in the front. And lastly, gluing a piece of fabric across the miter, a piece of silk, and then gessoing over it is your last defense from happening. And this is since 1913, it stayed the same.
Right.
They really knew what they were doing.
They certainly did.
One other comment about that portrait, the face, the head is the width of the frame, and it always seems to work out. I don't know why, but there's something about it. It always seems right for it.
Yeah.
The face is the
Yeah.
shape. They're similar in their abstract forms to our visual perception. So.
No, I did not know about that idea of the width of the frame mirroring the width of the face. It just felt right to me.
Well, you have good
It
taste.
just felt right.
Yeah, it's been it's a really great piece. Congratulations.
I appreciate you pointing that out because it was just an accidental thing, or maybe not so accidental on my part, but it just seemed to be right. It just seemed to be right. It felt right.
Well,
So I think
That's
we have some more frames to show from Jack here. Yes. I as I said, this was the frame, this was a painting I brought to Jack, my daughter Deborah. And this is the frame that Jack carved for it. And if you, the next slide read, you can see he made the corners of rosebuds and leaves and petals. And notice also the molding itself is not perfectly molded. He carved the molding itself all by hand. And I asked him, why did you do that? And he says, well, I try to make it as accurate as I can, but you can't do that. The lines are going to wiggle slightly. And the slight wiggle or movement of the line softens the whole effect of the frame.
Yeah.
It works just beautifully. And also notice the gilding. You don't see any leaf marks, anything like that. That's not seen in any of Jack's frames. Most everybody that I know of today that frames, makes gold leaf frames, they show the leaf marks. But Jack did not do this. And between the hand carving and the gentle carving of the outside and the way he put on the leaf, it really has a completely different, more beautiful poetic effect, I think. I don't think it's available these days. And next. Yes. This is a very special frame. I bought it from Jack just before he died. And this was a frame that Jack made when he was 15 years old. If you can believe that. He's 15 years old. He got the molding from a company, and the carving in the corner is sort of an imitation of the carving of an Edmund Tarbell frame. But then Jack went ahead and did this graffito, and I'll show that in a moment. But I exhibited this painting down in a gallery in Asheville, North Carolina. And one night, in the middle of the night, thieves broke into the gallery and stole that painting only. And the story apparently goes, this was in Asheville, North Carolina, August 14th, 1997. And I have a substantial reward for anybody who can locate this painting in the frame. But the FBI believes that there was an inside job between the gallery owner and a client. A very famous football player, a very famous quarterback, I would say, came to the gallery and just fell in love with this painting. The gallery only told me that. He just went nuts over it. A few weeks later, it was stolen. And the FBI believes that the gallery owner and this football player colluded to steal the painting and the frame because they wanted it. And the owner figured that the insurance on it that I had would cover my cost. So it's never been found. And as a result, I don't show any of my other Jack frames, paintings in Jack's frames. I don't show them outside of the studio anymore. It was very painful to lose that. But the next slide, please. There you can see the corner, the amazing sgraffito. This is a 15-year-old kid. Just amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I would call that genius. And clearly he was genius. He ended up being the longest employee of the Carrig-Rohane Frame Shop and chief foreman for many years. When I told Bill Vos Galleries in Boston about discovering Jack Ekberg, Bill Vos says, "Oh my God, he was a legend this day. How fortunate you were that we discovered him." So Jack made many frames over the years for me before he died, and he also sent me drawings of the designs for each of the frames before he made them. And so if we can get next slide, please. This would be an example on a landscape painting that I did of Monadnock in a very hazy autumn afternoon. This was a one shot afternoon thing. Yeah, excuse me a minute, I lose my voice after a while. And if you can see the corners in the next slide. Yeah. No line of the corner of the frame. You can see how the wave of the carving varies. The whole frame itself just is so perfectly melted into the frame, into the painting itself. It's just, I loved every frame that he did. I eventually got smart and kept the frames after letting, selling 20 or 30 of them with my paintings. I said, no, I can't afford to do that anymore. I'm gonna keep every frame that I can of him if possible. Next slide, please. And this is a portrait I did of my dad. He insisted on wearing his coat, fur coat and hat because he was bald. He said, "You're not going to paint me unless I wear that." So thank God I didn't argue with him. I had done a pencil drawing of him first without his hat. And when I painted the thing from life completely in a rather smooth style, and then I was thinking, my teacher, Mr. Gamble, was quite a curmudgeon and a tyrant in many respects. And he kept saying to me, "Richard, use more paint." So I said to myself, I'm going to show that guy. So I repainted, I palette knifed over the whole thing again and then repainted it. And I showed this showed this painting at a prominent gallery in New York. Called him up 2 or 3 weeks later and just said how things are going. He said, "Richard, I can't wait to take that painting off the wall." So I was quite shocked by that. But eventually I learned a few months later that many students at the Arts Student League went to the gallery specifically to study my painting. So I felt vindicated. Now, if you, next slide, please. And here's the magnificent frame. This is, I think, my favorite frame that I own from Jack, other than the one that was stolen. But you can see the delicacy in the corner carving. It also has a roughness to it. It's just a perfect match with the painting itself. Next slide, please. And these are drawings Jack did of some frames for me. I think this was a frame for the portrait of my youngest daughter, Emily. Many years later, I haven't been able to find a photograph of that. But I had him sign down on the lower right and date each drawing. Next slide. Read. There we go. Another example that probably was on a landscape. Sort of a floral, leaf sort of effect in the corners. And next slide. And this one he did on a toned paper. Here again, notice the cutting on the inside that faces the frame. It's a little rough there in the sketch, but even then you can see it just has such a naturalistic feeling. It looks like it was made in nature, not made by man. And I just love that effect. And this is done in red chalk heightened with white. And next slide, please. And this is Jack outside his shack. And I think that is the end of my story.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that, Richard. That was great. I love that photograph.
It's great. Bill and I are putting together a book on Jack Ekberg's frames, and we hope to get that out sometime later this year. And that's just going to be a wonderful project. I'm honored to be working with you, sir.
Well, I can't wait to put all this together, and I look forward to really sharing with people Jack's great legacy. And I want to just also mention that Richard sent me these 2 fantastic books. that he put together, Advice to a Young Artist, Letters from Eyes Gamble to Richard Whitney, and also Painting the Visual Impression. So every time I pick these books up, I have a revelation about painting, and it makes me think more about what a struggle it is to be an artist, and all of the various options. And the framing is only one small part of the story. But the ones who tough it out, like you, Richard, end up getting lucky and finding someone who they can work with, who understands the aesthetics, and that a landscape frame is a certain way and a portrait frame is another way. All of the idea.
A
You treat it like a sculpture, and I like that. Thank you.
Thank you. A few years after Jack died, I was able to find a framer in New York, Rob O'Donnell, who was at Regent's Frame Shop, and he's now at I would forget Quattro Frameworks.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
Yeah, and he's fantastic. He's been my framer for 30 years, and I used to look through his catalogs every time and pick out 2 or 3 frames, and he'd say, Richard, well, you know, this other frame here might work actually better. And he was usually right. So I said, do you mind, did you mind if I just send you a photograph of the painting, pick out your 3 favorite frames? And we've been doing that now for 25 years. I mean, he's almost never wrong. And he would pick out frames that I would not think about. It makes my paintings look so much better. So thank you, Rob, if you're here and listening.
Well, I think it would be wonderful. Yeah, he is.
Of
We
course.
want to get together at the old Schwam Mill someday when this pandemic is over, with
Yes,
some of our colleagues, and handle some of the frames that are still around that are made by these guys. It'd be fun to talk about it.
that would be wonderful.
I'd just like to remind folks, with the time we have left, that you can put any questions you've got into the chat. I do have one, someone's commented already, is it permitted to photo some of these fabulous pictures? And I'm not sure whether the person means within this presentation or on some other occasion.
I would assume within this presentation, I assume
Yeah.
the drawings of Jack, those are, oh gosh, he's been dead, I know, 40 years, 45, 50 years. I don't believe there's any copyright infringement on that. And
No.
I don't mind your photographing any of my paintings, just don't make prints out of them. There are companies in China that do reproduce my paintings. You can get a Richard Whitney for $150. And I was quite insulted at first by it. And then I thought, my God, here I am in Stoddard, New Hampshire, and they're reproducing my paintings in China. I'm thrilled to death. I'm the only artist that I know of that's doing that too.
Yeah, it's
So,
a compliment. Huh?
It's
Yeah.
a compliment. I'll reproduce away. Go for it. I don't care if I'm not making money on it. You know, my reputation just expands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question for either one of you, maybe Bill. We don't have a whole lot of correspondence between the Schwam Mill, Clinton or Louis Schwam, and the frame shops that they produced for, or even people like Tulin. We have some, but most of it's fairly business oriented. How much back and forth might there have been in ordering a certain profile? Or would the drawing have been sufficient and then they would have done other work to it on their own when they actually received it? Because the Schwams, of course, are making these with a machine with 4 cutter heads, and they could be very precise if they had the right measurements. But I don't know whether it would have been typical for frame makers like this to have very particular notions of what they wanted.
Well, you might want to check some of the records of other sister organizations that have gathered this stuff, like the Colonial website, the Massachusetts Colonial Society. They might have records of Dahlin Richards, who I mentioned earlier. Some of the Miller is another great frame maker there. There was quite a number of them. and they may have actually made their own, milled their own wood. And the Schwabs may have become a novelty. By the turn of the century, things had changed, you know, electric motors and other things like that. But what's so remarkable about the mill is how Pat Fitzmaurice single-handedly saved it, because it would have been a parking lot otherwise if it hadn't been for her. And that's just I took my first frame seminar there. It's a magical spot that you all have resurrected, and finding the records of other framers would just be a labor of love. Dermot, I think you might be able to dig in some of those archives and find some interesting facts.
Well, the Carrig-Rohane shop that I mentioned to you folks and you were aware of, those archives, should I visit them, probably have some correspondence, maybe more than what the Schwabs kept over the years.
Well, that would be the Vos brothers, who gave the majority of that for the to the Smithsonian, which was a really great and generous thing that they did. But Bill Terry might still have records there that would be useful to explore, and especially with the Tulin connection and Tulin working with them and Jack all the way up to, well, World War II. That's when it folded.
Someone's asking, can we have a tour of the mill as a group post-pandemic?
Yes.
The mill is open Tuesdays and Saturdays from 10 to 4, and we're maintaining the master requirement, but that's it. Usually we try to have windows open, especially on a day like today where it was 60.
Beautiful.
But absolutely, just contact the mill, info@oldschwamill.org, or you can go to our website, Old Schwa Mill, and contact us by email. And Ed Gordon will arrange for a group tour if you want that. Yeah, we're happy to do it. That's why one of the reasons we're in existence still, really, is to share that with people. Do either of you have a sense here? Is the question of how big the Carrig-Rohane shop was, and were shop workers specialists?
I have a sense that there might have been 4 or 5 guys, and yes, there were specialists. Adrian was Jack's dad, and he told me that he specialized in sgraffito, and this is where Jack learned it. Jack went to art school and worked with Murphy, and he was kind of a liaison. So they're a cleanup guy, a photographer. I would say 5 or 6 people, it would be my guess, and no more than that, because it wasn't a factory.
Right.
There's another question here. What is the present value of Carrig-Rohane frames?
Well, the frame on Sandy's portrait, I looked it up a few years ago. In perfect condition, 35,000 at least.
Yeah.
Probably the condition of mine, maybe 20, 25. I'm guessing.
Well, I would say a lot more, Richard, because
Well,
it's one of a kind. It's priceless. It has provenance. I've learned that these are just average prices that you've got there. So, but to make it at today's labor rate, it could be copied, okay, by someone. And my guess is a frame like that its replacement value might be $7,000 or $8,000. Kind of thinking maybe 10 by the time it's over, depending on the size. But that's just a wild guess. Do you have any idea, Richard?
no.
What, someone might,
No idea.
if they could even do it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because the molding itself is handmade rather than machine made. It's
Right.
the whole thing.
Yeah. It's got that wobble to it.
Exactly.
And this is exactly what this Jack made this for me. I gave him the wood already shaped, and he wobbled it out.
Wobbled it out, yes.
You know, there's not a single plane on this that doesn't move.
Right.
And that of course requires a lot of skill.
Yes.
We call
and
it.
it makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
Because otherwise.
How individual were, oh, sorry, Richard, how individual were those Carrig-Rohane frames? Because those ones by Jack sound like each one was different. But
Well,
with
they were
Carrig
kind of
Rohane-
one-off. There were patterns that they worked from, and that's why they photographed. And each pattern had a number. And the workbooks at the Smithsonian, which I've gone over, had all the details in it, the sizes, sometimes client names, sometimes mainly finishing instructions to the craftsman who was going to do the job, or as a reminder to the person who wrote it up, I have to put this tone on it. And so these were really terrific handmade objects that, in my opinion, are kind of priceless
Yes,
because they're only one-offs.
they're as one of a kind as you can get these days.
Yeah.
At that time, yes.
Robert Anderson says he has a couple of remarks to offer. Robert, just go ahead and unmute, I think, and you can speak.
Sure. First of all, there are a number of coincidences that have brought me to this Zoom meeting, and not the least of which is that Richard, Whitney, and I have been running parallel careers for about 50 years. And it's wonderful to see you, Richard, now after it's been a number of years since I last saw you.
Yeah. You guys have
And,
brought us together.
I have
Good.
such admiration for
Thank
your path and what you've achieved, and it's
Thank you.
been a great ride I think for both of us.
Yes.
Second of all, as a former trustee of the old Schwann Mill for a number of years, I became quite close to Pat Fitzmaurice, and she arranged for some frames of some paintings that I had done. I'm also a portrait painter, and I delivered the eulogy at her memorial after she passed, and I lived in the Boston area for a long time, and after the old Haley and Steel frame shop changed hands and from Dick Haley to the Nagy brothers. The Nagy brothers had a basement full of old frames where people would come in and dump the frames from their old paintings and wanting something more contemporary. And I offered to take them off Bill Nagy's hands and had them. And there were some 70 maybe frames.
Wow.
And I can't remember if there was a Carrig-Rohane frame in that batch or not, but Bill Adair, I'm not sure whether it was you or Eli Wilner who sent a picker over to my studio in Lexington, where I was living, to check out what, I'm sorry?
That would have been Eli.
It was probably Eli. Anyway, there were, out of the 70, there were maybe, a half a dozen that this fellow took some interest in. And in the end, I decided to donate all 70 of the frames, or I think I might have kept a couple out. I think I still have them, to donate them all to the mill. And I don't know what's happened to them. And
We have those, Robert. I'm almost certain that I think they were all photographed and sort of cataloged.
they're all cataloged, and I have, if there are any gaps in your inventory, I'm such a pack rat that I probably have that original inventory too. So
No,
that-
we also, I believe, have that. I've seen it along with maybe some of the discussion of that. And they are sort of in vertical holders in the attic.
there were some pretty nice ones in there, and I think Pat's thought was maybe we could just restore them and sell them, or I'm not sure what the plan was, and then I kind of lost track of what happened. But it was a really it was a nice collection, and I'm sort of in the Boston area by way of Connecticut now. I was in Cambridge and Lexington for years, and now I'm on the south coast of Massachusetts below the Cape, and but still have great fondness for the mill. I haven't been back for a while, but I followed things. And I'm not in touch now with Christy Cunningham Adams, but I imagine that you are. And I think isn't she a trustee emerita or something?
She's
still?
on our advisory council,
Yeah,
and absolutely, we're in touch with her either by phone or when she visits, or by letter.
yeah. Well, she, the last I saw her, I did a portrait of Alan Greenspan for the Federal Reserve, and Christy, I met Christy in Washington, and she came to that. And so we had a nice kind of, renewal of our friendship. And so that was nice, but it's wonderful to see all this happening around the mill. And it's the mill is such a familiar place to me. And I, used to come and, Pat would open the door and those beautiful cornflower blue eyes just shining out, luminous she had her own light. She didn't need light from outside. I wish I'd painted her because she was just the most amazing person. And stood with her arms crossed with the wrecking ball, just about to knock the mill down. And she stood up to every bit of it and was an amazing person.
Thanks
I'll
very
read.
much, Robert. And there's going to be plenty of people on this meeting who also recall Pat, and will treasure those words. I will say that we'll have to be in touch a little bit about the collection, because we've talked about trying to make as good use as we can of that third floor space, although it's not really a public space. Yeah, absolutely. We're very much aware of it, and I think we've got the documentation that Patricia would have collected at the time.
Yeah, well, that's great. And there were also several, I think there were calendar paintings by John Kleimer that were donated by American Cyanamid, and I had done some work for them years ago, and they were getting rid of everything. They didn't know what they had. They were about to put those out in the dumpster.
Yeah.
Which was, would have been a shame. So, but I don't think they have the value that his easel paintings had, because I think they were calendar paintings that he'd done for American Cyanamid or something. But those should still be in the closet somewhere at the mill.
Yeah,
Unless-
Patricia tended to save that stuff too in flat files. So, and we may well actually have those. I'll have to check the index we keep for what she left in those flat files.
Yeah, if I can say one thing, Bob, I'd love to hear from you very soon after this video. Please get in touch with me, whatever, like to talk. Be very nice.
I'd also like to remind people that the current exhibit at the mill, we try to do one exhibit of our own every year. And the current one is called Into the Woods from Tree to Frame. And it shows not only the process by which we make frames now, but some history of the Schwann Mill and frames in the 19th century, and the woods that frames are made from, and some of the research we've done on the woods used for frames at the mill over the years, chiefly
Yeah.
bass and birch, by the way, and some oak.
That's great.
And so people are most welcome to see that exhibit if they come on Tuesdays and Saturdays from 10 to 4.
I'd love
We
to come
don't
back.
have an easy way to view the frame collection that we've talked about, both the one that Robert mentioned, but also the ones donated by Wayne Schwamm that were part of his father's business, L. Wayne. And we've talked, one of the things the board has talked about over the years is sort of how to make better use of that collection and share it, while obviously continuing to have other exhibits at the mill too. So,
Well, sometime I'd love to come back and for a visit, kind of catch up on everything, because it's been a long time. I was in Lexington until I think 1997, and then moved to Connecticut, and I've been here for a while. But I've been back to the mill since Pat died. So I'd love to come back and just kind of reacquaint myself with what's happening.
well, you definitely should do it. And I'd remind people too, we have a whole part of the exhibit on frames, which was contributed to the exhibit by Bill Adair, including tools used in gold leafing and other aspects of frame making. And that's all in the first room of the exhibit. So there's many, many things to see there if you decide to come by. If you have any interest at all in frames or
Historic trees.
interior decor in the 19th and 20th centuries, please do stop in. The exhibit's up until June.
Oh, great.
Great, I'll try to connect with someone and pay a visit.
And maybe Bill and Richard, if you have any sort of closing thoughts, I guess, on the period that we're talking about in Boston or wherever else of these kind of individualized frame making, or the individuals that you've discussed tonight and the Carrig-Rohane Frame Shop, and anything you might like to leave our guests with.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for inviting me to participate in this event. I will say that at the turn of the century, the Boston School of Painting was literally the premier school in the country. And then the Ashcan School in New York came into existence, and Philip Hale of the Boston School wrote some very nasty criticism of the New York school, and therefore the New York school got even by removing the history of the Boston School from the history books for a long time. And that's finally being the great masters at the beginning of the 20th century are finally getting their due now. And so perhaps the future will balance it out a bit, that there were great painters working in Boston and not just in New York. New York was not the only center of art. There were many other centers, including Boston. Santa Fe had a huge group. Out in California, a huge group of painters, wonderful artists throughout the country.
Richard, I'd like to reiterate that about the Boston painters, in particular, one Abbott Thayer, who was the inventor of camouflage for U.S. Army and Navy.
Yep.
Air Force, was ridiculed during his time, but has proven now that he was a
Right.
genius and the father of camouflage, and trained all the camoufleurs, and really came up with the concept of that. And this was out of the Boston training there. And he also went to France
Right.
to study with Jerome, but he came back and really was a great teacher and influencer on modern art and abstraction, because camouflage was this ability to hide what you don't see, what you see together in a painting. So that was a remarkable germ of creativity that originated in Boston.
Well, also, he deserves great recognition for probably the hundreds of thousands of soldiers worldwide that he saved from death, because camouflage is used by every country in the world now.
Richard, he was talking about how an artist can contribute to humankind. And what people don't realize is that his father was a surgeon for the Civil War, one of the top army surgeons. So he saw the suffering of war, but he was an artist and a naturalist, a transcendentalist, and basically wanted to contribute to society. So he published a book in 1913 with his son, Gerald, Protective Coloration in the Animal Kingdom, in hopes of influencing this ability to.
I would agree with Tarbell also about the divinity of nature. I'm sort of a transcendentalist also.
Yeah.
And very deeply influenced by, Thoreau, living at a pond out in the middle of nowhere. Well, my pond is, Thoreau would be terribly jealous. I mean,
All right. Richard, this is cool. We'll have to hike Mount Monadnock someday, okay?
I don't know. I'm 76 now. I'm not so sure.
Okay, we'll walk over there.
I can go up, but going down, my left knee give me a problem.
Well, this has been a great Zoom meeting with
That's
everybody.
wonderful.
Ed,
Thank
do you want to send us out?
I just want to say thank you all so much. And we'll be putting a March program together soon. And we'd love for you to come back and visit the mill. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you. Wonderful
Thank
Bye, everybody.
event.
Thanks.